The sound wasn't a hum of a server. It was the rhythmic, wet thud of a massive piston. Thump, hiss, thump, hiss. I stood in the heart of the old Archon data center, buried 400 feet under the Blue Ridge Mountains. But the cables weren't carrying data anymore. They were carrying pulse. I pulled back the steel floor plating, and I didn't find wiring. I found a network of optic nerves the size of high-voltage lines, all leading to the center of the room. There, suspended by rusted chains, was a cluster of 3 human torsos, their limbs removed and their torsos fused together into a triangular engine block. Their collective rib cages had been expanded and reinforced with titanium struts to act as the primary cylinders for a steam-driven mechanism. As I watched, a jet of superheated mist erupted from a valve carved into a shared trachea, sending a spray of copper-scented condensation across my face. The Appalachian engine wasn't just running, it was accelerating, using the heat of 3 living metabolisms to power a clock that could be heard for miles. The third tooth found in the static house led me far away from the city streets of Chicago, deep into the jagged, fog-choked peaks of the Appalachian Mountains. Here, nestled within a valley that the Archon Group had labeled as unstable terrain for 30 years, sat the entrance to Site B, the primary backup data center for the entire Midwest simulation. In the archive, this place was a fortress of silicon and cold air, a sanctuary for the source code that kept our digital lives running smoothly. But as I approached the rusted blast doors, I realized that without the Archon's maintenance filters, the facility looked less like a bunker and more like a massive, decaying organ. The air around the entrance was unnaturally warm, a humid, tropical heat that felt out of place in the high-altitude chill of the Blue Ridge Range. I could smell the old rot before I even saw the door, a heavy, musky scent that reminded me of a greenhouse filled with dying lilies and stagnant water. The heavy steel doors had been pried open from the inside, the metal curled back like the petals of a scorched flower, revealing a darkness that seemed to be breathing. I stepped over the threshold, the beam of my heavy-duty torch cutting through a thick, yellow mist that tasted of iron and sulfur, coating the back of my throat in a bitter film. As I descended the emergency stairs, the silence was gradually replaced by a low-frequency vibration that I felt in my marrow before I heard it with my ears. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of cooling fans or the buzz of electrical transformers. It was a deep, guttural thrumming that shook the concrete walls. Every step deeper into the earth felt like a descent into the throat of a massive beast, the temperature rising with every floor I passed. I noticed that the walls were weeping a thick, translucent fluid that looked like spinal fluid, dripping from the ventilation ducts and pooling in the corners of the stairwell like stagnant sap. I reached the level 4 server room, but the familiar rows of black server racks had been completely engulfed by a sprawling gray-black mass of fungal growth. The fungus didn't look like a plant. It looked like muscle tissue that had been stretched thin and dried in the sun, pulsing with a faint bioluminescent light. It had woven itself through the wiring conduits, replacing the copper cables with thick, throbbing veins that were pumping a dark, viscous fluid toward the center of the facility. I realized that the Carver hadn't just sabotaged the data center. He had used the infrastructure of the old world as a nervous system for his new organic machine. I stood at the edge of the main server floor, my torchlight reflecting off the wet, pulsating walls, and I felt a sense of profound vertigo. The Archon Group had spent decades trying to digitize the human experience, but the Carver was doing the opposite. He was biologizing the machine. He was taking the sterile, predictable logic of the computer and forcing it to adapt to the messy, unpredictable rot of life. I moved toward the sound of the thumping, my boots sticking to the fleshy floor with a wet, tearing sound, knowing that I was about to find the third gear. The countdown was no longer a ticking watch or a humming house. It had become an industrial heartbeat. Location: Blue Ridge Data Center, Sector 4. Victims: 3 unidentified adult males, ages 30 to 40. The Appalachian engine represents a massive escalation in the Carver's engineering capabilities, moving from individual timepieces to a collective power plant. We are no longer looking at a single body being repurposed, but a tri-valve integration where 3 separate nervous systems have been synchronized to act as a single unit. The forensic challenge is staggering. The victims have been surgically altered to share a single circulatory loop, with their hearts acting as sub-pumps for a larger central piston. The immunology and neurology necessary for this level of synchronization borders on the supernatural, as the bodies are not rejecting one another, but instead thriving in their shared agony. Upon closer inspection, I found that the Carver had used the old Archon liquid cooling pipes to act as exoskeletal arteries for the engine block. The cooling fluid, originally a synthetic violet chemical, had been replaced by a mixture of human blood and a high-viscosity oil that smelled of scorched cinnamon. The heat generated by the 3 metabolisms is being funneled into a steam generator that powers a massive bone-carved crankshaft located at the rear of the assembly. Every time the engine breathes, it generates enough torque to rotate a gear that weighs at least 2 tons, a gear made entirely of compressed, calcified human skull fragments. Dr. Aris Thorne refused to enter the room at first, his medical mind unable to process the efficiency of the Carver's work. When he finally joined me, he pointed out that the victims' brains hadn't been removed, but had been overclocked using a series of copper electrodes driven into the frontal lobes. "He's using their pain as a fuel source, Silas," Thorne whispered, his voice cracking as he looked at the monitors that were still flickering with life signs. "The irrelevant spikes are what keep the pistons moving. The more they suffer, the faster the engine turns. It's a perpetual motion machine, powered by pure, unadulterated trauma." We found construction markers scattered around the server floor, discarded surgical staples made of silver,
jars of a preservative agent that looked like liquefied amber, and a set of blueprints etched on a sheet of cured human skin. The blueprints showed a map of the entire Appalachian range, with a series of veins running through the underground coal mines and water tables. The Carver isn't just building a machine in a bunker. He's trying to infect the geography itself, using the Site B data center as the primary pump for a regional biological network. He's turning the mountains into a living organism, and the engine is the heart that keeps the blood flowing through the stone. The 3 victims, whom we have labeled Alpha, Beta, and Gamma, are currently in a state of locked-in synchronization. Their eyes have been removed and replaced with pressure gauges that measure the steam output of their shared lungs. There's no way to disconnect them without triggering a catastrophic system collapse that would likely take the entire mountain with it. As I stood there, recording the forensic data into my recorder, I realized that the 3rd gear was not a component I could take with me. It was a permanent installation, a landmark of horror that would continue to tick long after I left the facility. The sound wasn't the hum of a server. It was the rhythmic, wet thud of a massive piston. Thump, hiss, thump, hiss. I stood in the heart of the old Archon data center, buried 400 feet under the Blue Ridge Mountains. But the cables weren't carrying data anymore. They were carrying pulse. I pulled back the steel floor plating, and I didn't find wiring. I found a network of optic nerves the size of high-voltage lines, all leading to the center of the room. The vibration was so violent, it made my vision blur, a bone-shaking frequency that felt like it was trying to realign my own internal organs to match the rhythm of the machine. There, suspended by rusted chains, was a cluster of 3 human torsos, their limbs removed and their torsos fused together into a triangular engine block. Their collective rib cages had been expanded and reinforced with titanium struts to act as the primary cylinders for a steam-driven mechanism. Every time the engine breathes, it generates enough torque to rotate a gear that weighs at least 2 tons. A gear made entirely of pressed, calcified human skull fragments.
"Is the pressure stable?" I shouted over the roar of the steam, but my voice was swallowed by the rhythmic thud hiss of the pistons. I could see the skin of the victims stretching and tearing as the pistons moved within them, only to be instantly cauterized by the heat of the steam. The Carver had installed a series of self-repairing grafts that used the victim's own stem cells to heal the damage in real time, ensuring that the engine would never wear out. It was a cycle of destruction and rebirth that happened every 4 seconds, a tick of the clock that was paid for with a fresh wave of agony for the 3 souls trapped in the center. I reached out to touch the central crankshaft, the bone gear spinning with such velocity that it created a localized wind that smelled of ozone and rot. As my hand got close, the engine seemed to respond to my presence, the rhythm of the thumping shifting to a faster, more aggressive pace. The 3 gauges in the victim's eye sockets began to spin wildly, their needles buried in the red zone as the pressure in the room began to spike. The walls of the bunker groaned under the strain, the concrete cracking as the Appalachian engine tried to expand beyond its physical limits. I didn't hesitate. I reached for the emergency release valve, but as I did, a small compartment in the central engine block hissed open. Inside was not a lever, but a small blood-stained tooth marked with a Roman numeral 3.
The Carver had placed the next step directly into the heart of the heat source, forcing me to reach through the steam and the rotating bone gears to claim it. I felt the heat blistering my skin as I grabbed the tooth, the engine letting out a final deafening shriek of steam that sounded like a three-part harmony of the damned. I pulled my hand back just as the mechanism settled back into its steady, terrifying rhythm. Holding the 3-tooth in my blistered hand, I realized that the winding key I had carried from the first crime scene was not just a tool for resetting these machines. It was a tuning fork. I took the key out of my pocket, and the oxidized brass began to vibrate in sympathy with the Appalachian engine, a high-pitched ringing that cut through the low-frequency thrum of the pistons. Dr. Thorne watched me with a look of pure terror as I moved the key toward the central timing port, located at the base of the fused torsos. We knew that if the timing was off even by a millisecond, the resulting explosion would level the facility and release the old rot into the mountain's water table. "Silas, don't!" Thorne whispered, but he didn't move to stop me. He was just as captivated by the mechanical beauty of the horror as I was. I inserted the key into the port, and the sensation was like plugging a live wire into my own spine, a surge of real-world energy that nearly knocked me off my feet. I turned the key once, and the engine groaned, the speed of the bone gears slowing to a manageable pace. I turned it a second time, and the screaming whistle of the steam subsided into a low, mournful sigh that echoed through the ventilation ducts like a ghost. The 3 victims didn't die when the engine slowed. They simply idled. Their breathing became shallow, and the pressure gauges in their eyes settled at the 6 mark, indicating that the engine was now in a state of suspended animation. I realized that the Carver had built these machines to be synchronized with a master clock that I hadn't found yet. By winding the Appalachian engine, I wasn't stopping it. I was calibrating it. I was ensuring that when the 12th clock finally struck, this mountain would be ready to perform its role in the Great Reset. I pulled the key out, and the 3-tooth in my hand began to glow with a faint bioluminescent light that matched the fungus on the walls. The Carver was communicating through the biology of his victims, using the engine as a transmitter to send a signal directly into my mind. I saw images of a coastline, a lighthouse of black stone, and a sea that was made of churning gray gears instead of water. The 3rd gear was a power source, and the 4th gear was a beacon, located somewhere on the edge of the world where the simulation's render distance used to end. We left the bunker as the sun began to set over the Appalachians, the mountains looking like the jagged teeth of a massive sleeping beast. The ground beneath my boots was still vibrating, a gentle rhythmic pulse that told me the engine was still there, breathing in the dark. I looked at the 3rd tooth and saw the new coordinates unfolding in my mind like a map made of veins. The Carver was no longer just a killer. He was an architect, and I was the one who was providing the maintenance for his vision. I was the auditor of the apocalypse. The Appalachian audit has proven that the Carver is not interested in local terror. He is interested in global infrastructure. The engine in Site B is just one of many, a network of biological power plants that are waiting for the final command to wake up the world. I have shared the forensic data with the few remaining authorities, but their eyes are blank, their minds still struggling to accept a reality that doesn't have an undo button. They look at the photos of the triangular torsos and see only a crime. I look at them and see a system update that we are not prepared to receive. I am currently traveling toward the east coast, following the coordinates etched into the third tooth. The location is an old lighthouse in Maine, a place that was once a loading zone for the Archon Group's oceanic renders. The Carver is moving toward the edges of the map, toward the places where the real world and the simulated world used to bleed into each other. I can still taste the sulfur and iron of the Appalachian bunker in the back of my throat, a reminder that the old rot is now a part of me, a biological infection that I cannot delete. The Carver's journal spoke of a great reset that would begin when the 12 gears are synchronized, a moment when the artificial heart would be replaced by the bone clock. Standing on the cliffs of Maine, watching the gray churning Atlantic, I realized that the Archon Group wasn't just hiding the Carver from us. They were hiding us from the truth of time. We lived in a world where time was a digital constant. But in the real world, time is a physical weight, a grinding, crushing force that eventually turns everything into dust. The Carver is just the one who has decided to speed up the process. I found the box for the fourth victim sitting on the railing of the lighthouse, a small container of driftwood and sealed with a numbered tooth. Inside is not a thumb or an ear, but a human eye still moving in its socket, still watching the horizon for the coming storm. The eye is marked with the Roman numeral 4, and it's looking at a point in the ocean where the water is starting to tick. The countdown is no longer a whisper, it's a roar that is drowning out the sound of the waves. My name is Silas Vance. I am the man who broke the world, and I am the man who is trying to put it back together with the only tools I have left: gears of bone and a key of brass. The fourth gear is calling, and the elm alarm is getting louder with every second that passes. If you're still watching these audits, then you are part of the sync. Stay awake, stay alert. The 12th hour is closer than you think.